Bob Peak, Austin Briggs, Robert McGinnis, Al Parker. These are some of the names that come to mind when I think of that like golden era of illustration, that mid-century era of illustration. That's really the stuff that I love the most as far as illustration work is concerned. That's the era that influences me and inspires me the most. And those artists that I just named are some of my absolute favorites. And it was the main reason why I picked up this comic right here called The Human Target. This is drawn by Greg Smallwood. It's written by Tom King. The Human Target apparently was a DC character that was co-created by Carmine Infantino. Carmine Infantino taught at SVA, but he stopped teaching there before I was able to study over there. Unfortunately, I was never able to study with him, but there's a really great Carmine Infantino interview online, and it's just interesting to hear how he talks about his time in comics as editor and I believe art director at one point for DC Comics, and also an artist and a writer. He talks very frankly and kind of like matter-of-factly about the whole business and his time in it, the way a lot of guys from that era kind of spoke about it. It's very different than the way we kind of speak about our craft today. I really like it. I love listening to those older guys talk about that particular time in comics. But anyway, that's a side note. I'll leave a link for that interview in the description below if I could remember. It's worth checking out. But this Human Target series was, I guess, a like revival of that older character brought up into a more modern day approach. And it's drawn by one of my favorite, more contemporary comic artists and illustrator, Greg Smallwood. One of the reasons why I love his art so much is because he cites those older illustrators in his own work. You can tell that he's heavily influenced by that stuff and that era, and he directly brings that into his own comic book work. And perhaps no more so than this particular run on The Human Target that he did. This is the first volume. I think there was maybe a second and possibly a third volume as well. I don't have those. But the artwork in here is really, really beautiful. In this video, we're gonna just really be talking about the artwork, not so much the story, because I think the artwork is so responsible for the overall feel of this particular comic. And it's really cool that although this is like brought up to date, this older character is kind of brought up to date in this way, it's heavily referencing that like early 60s Mad Men era. And I couldn't think of a more perfect artist for this than Greg Smallwood. He has a storytelling approach in his comics that when other artists do it, I'm not as crazy about it, but I think he's just such a great artist and drawer that his pacing and his more cinematic approach to telling comic stories, it just works so well. The subtleties, you could really feel them. They don't get lost, or they also don't feel like stiff and static. A lot of his shots feel like they come straight off of the small screen or the big screen. And there, like I mentioned, is a real cinematic pacing to his comics. I think when you go too far with that stuff, oftentimes for me, it feels too stiff, just because there are similarities between cinema and TV and comics, but there's also these intangible differences as well. For some reason or another, Greg Smallwood seems to be able to straddle that line in a really unique way. And he's able to get across those like quiet little pauses that film is able to do really well, but comics have a harder time doing. I think also because of his attention to detail, you could tell that his work is heavily researched in terms of setting, environment, era. I think because of that, it's really hard not to just get completely immersed in the atmosphere of this comic the way that you would with a movie or a TV show. I've mentioned this before, but comics are a much less passive form of entertainment. There's a certain amount of work that the reader has to do. It's one of the beautiful things about comics, similar to reading a novel, reading poetry, whatever it might be. There's a certain thing that you kind of have to bring to it. Whereas with TV and movies, it's a lot more passive. It just kind of happens to you. But when a writer or a comic artist can make you feel as though the story is just kind of happening to you, it's very easy to kind of just get lost in that particular world. That's a huge accomplishment. That's a much harder thing to accomplish in comics than in TV or movies, in my opinion. This is also not a traditionally drawn comic in the sense that there's a penciler, an inker, and a colorist. This, as far as I know, is all done by Greg Smallwood. So he has control over all the visual elements of this comic, and I think he takes full advantage of that and really uses it to his benefit. I love the lack of panel borders, the way the color palette changes depending on where we're at in the story, time of day. There's a lot of jumps to different types of environments and backgrounds in the story, and he really uses the color to make sure you feel like you're in a different place every time. When there's outdoor scenes, you could really smell the fresh air and hear the water. He works digitally and he uses it so well to create real art, in my opinion. I think sometimes working digitally can be a function of pure convenience, which is totally fine. I sometimes work digitally too for that very reason. But when you're working on a long comic project and you only choose to work on it digitally for convenience, I think you're giving up so many other artistic liberties. And it seems as though he's making the very best out of working digitally and using it as an artistic advantage and really making it kind of like part of the storytelling in and of itself. So for instance, the lack of panel borders, the attention to color and lighting and shadow, having that all be like an integral part of the art itself, that's all a product of being able to work on it holistically together digitally, whereas that would be a lot harder to control and balance if working traditionally. There's also really obvious and really cool nods to that particular era of illustration that I love so much. Certain poses, certain splash pages, they look straight out of magazine illustration from the 50s and 60s. Like any good visual storyteller, he's able to tell a story in one image if he has to. You could feel the emotion of that scene. You get to understand the character through that particular scene. And then, unlike many others who are able to do that with one image, Greg Smallwood is also able to tell the story sequentially too, in just as an effective way. From what I've gathered online, it seems like he's also not afraid to share his process and post how he goes about making some of these pages. It's fascinating to see how he brings this art to life. He uses a lot of reference, taking his own photos. It seems like he uses digital composites also as reference. And in a Twitter thread that I had seen at one point, he shows how he works directly off of those photographs and he designs the page photographically first, just by compositing photographs that he posed for, some maybe digital backgrounds, and then he, for lack of a better term, traces over it. But this is more than just tracing. I know none of you watching this would have this thought, but I think a lot of people outside of the art making process think that, oh, I could do that too, it's just tracing. And of course, that couldn't be further from the truth. If you give a skilled artist who has a true vision and the experience of making art reference to work on top of, trace, and then you give someone who's never drawn or painted or created anything visually before, and you ask them to trace it, you're going to get two very, very different outcomes. He's using that reference as a guide and a way to create a stronger vision to tell this story in a very specific way that is very much rooted in reality. So he wants this to feel much more real and cinematic, and therefore he's using that approach to serve this particular storytelling vision. But all the stylistic drawing that he's doing on top of it, the way he's simplifying shapes like folds and drapery, simplifying facial expressions, and doing it in a consistent way throughout the book. That's the key right there, to be able to have a style that you can work that way and still the outcome is consistent every time. It doesn't falter and sort of succumb to the reference that he's using. It never looks like it's just a photograph. It always looks like it's his unique style. In fact, before he posted that whole thing about his process, I didn't know that he worked that way at all. But like I've mentioned so far throughout this video, it seems like everything he does, from using the reference photos to working digitally to pacing the story the way he's pacing the story, it's all there to serve the greater good of the project itself. And that's really the vision of a true artist and a true creator, in my opinion. So yeah, if you're not familiar with Greg Smallwood's work, or if you're not familiar with this Human Target series that he worked on, I definitely recommend picking it up, if not only just for the art. I'd love to see an edition that really goes into depth on his process and shows a lot of his preliminary stuff and character designs and all that stuff. I feel like I really want to understand his process and take a look at more of his unfinished work. So if you know of any more places, whether online or in book form, where I could see more of Greg Smallwood's process and a little bit more of his creative mind, definitely let me know in the comments. So yeah, hopefully you dig this video and this little look into some of Greg Smallwood's work on Human Target and how it kind of overlaps and interjects some of that golden age of editorial illustration and advertising illustration, all the stuff that I really love as far as the illustration world is concerned. I try to bring that stuff into my own work as much as I can. In fact, I've mentioned this before, but I have this 5-part video series on my Patreon where I create an illustration. I take a pencil drawing and turn it into a final ink drawing with tone and color. And I kind of show you some of the process throughout. I go a lot deeper into the process than I do in some of the more shorter process videos that I might post online. But one of the things that I talk about in the 5-part series is some of my inspiration for that particular piece. And a lot of it compositionally and tonally was really inspired by guys like Bob Peak and Austin Briggs and just that era of illustration that I love so much. So if you want to check out that 5-part series, head over to my Patreon. You could sign up for the Patreon to watch it, or you could just buy it outright. I'll leave links in the description where you can do either one of those things. Check that out if that interests you. Anyway, that's all I got for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any other questions or comments about anything you saw in this video, please do leave them in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching. As always, I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.